Unsuitable, Mrs. Dorcas Perlow announced, setting her teacup down on Martha's kitchen table with the finality of a judge's gavel. Completely and wholly unsuitable. The man has no land to speak of, no family name in this county, and I am told he once spent 3 nights in a Boise jail for fighting. I will not have my reputation attached to such a recommendation. Martha Greer stood at the stove with her back to the matchmaker, stirring a pot of bean soup that didn't need stirring. She kept her hand moving in slow circles and said nothing for a moment. Outside, the October wind pressed against the cabin walls. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold and were dropping their leaves in sheets. "I didn't ask for your blessing, Mrs. Perlow," Martha said at last, her voice even. "I asked for your knowledge of available men in the territory. You've given me your opinion instead. They are the same thing in this case." Mrs. Perlow gathered her shawl. She was a stout woman with careful hair and a mouth like a class purse. "Abel Croft is a drifter and a laborer. He came through Caldwell 2 seasons back, hired on at the Renner Ranch, and left under circumstances no one can fully explain. He is not the sort of man a decent widow takes in." "Where is he now?" Martha asked. Mrs. Perlow blinked. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Croft? Where is he now? Is he in Silver Creek or is he gone again?" The matchmaker's chin lifted. "He is camped on the Delaney pasture, I'm told, doing fence work by the day." She stood and smoothed her skirt. "Martha, you have a daughter to think of. You have a homestead that requires a steady hand. You need a man of standing." "What I need," Martha said, turning from the stove at last and looking the woman square in the eye, "is someone who can split wood before December and won't steal from me. Good afternoon, Mrs. Perlow." The matchmaker left without finishing her tea. The wind found the gap under the door and moved through the kitchen like a cold thought. Martha looked at the soup, then looked at the chair across the table, the one that had been empty for 2 years, and made up her mind. Mrs. Perlow had called Abel Croft unsuitable. Martha Greer had been called unsuitable once too, by people who turned out to be wrong about most everything. She put on her coat and went to find the man. She rode the 3 miles to the Delaney fence line, with the afternoon sun flat and pale behind a scrim of cloud. She found him where she'd been told she'd find him, stringing wire alone, his horse tied to a post, a short stack of cut rails beside him. He didn't hear her coming until she was nearly stopped. He turned without alarm, the way a man turns who has learned not to be startled. Abel Croft was lean and weather-colored, somewhere north of 35. He had a jaw that had met a fist at least once and hadn't been apologized to. His hat was decent enough. His boots were not. He looked at her with steady gray eyes and waited. "You're Abel Croft," she said. "I am." His voice was low and unadorned. "And you are?" "Martha Greer. I have a homestead 2 miles east of Silver Creek, 160 acres, half of it arable, a well that holds through August, a cabin with a sound roof, and a barn that needs a new hayloft floor." He studied her, the way a man studies a contract before signing. "Mrs. Greer, it is. My husband died of a chest sickness 2 winters back. I have been running the place alone since, with my daughter helping as she can. I am not running it well enough. I will lose the south field next summer if I don't get it broken and planted before May. I cannot do that alone." He set down his wire pliers. "What are you proposing?" She had rehearsed this on the ride over, and she said it plainly. "I am proposing a legal arrangement, a working contract between 2 adults who need what the other has. You work the land. I provide the house, the meals, and a fair wage from whatever the harvest brings. We would marry for the legal protection it gives both of us, so no one can question your right to be on the property, or my right to make decisions about it." He was quiet a moment. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the brown grass. And when the arrangement no longer suits, we discuss it like adults, Martha said. I am not sentimental about it. I am practical. Most people who say they're not sentimental, Abel said slowly, turn out to be the most sentimental of all. That surprised her. She hadn't expected a drifter to have opinions about human nature. She kept her face neutral. Most people who spend 3 nights in a Boise jail don't quote philosophy. He almost smiled, just a tightening at the corners of his mouth. Mrs. Perlow already got to you. She got to me this morning. I'm talking to you this afternoon. Martha gathered her reins. I'll give you a day to think on it. If you want to know more, come to the homestead tomorrow morning. If you don't come, I'll understand. She turned her horse and rode back toward the low autumn sun without looking over her shoulder, which was harder than she made it look. He came the next morning. He arrived before 8 o'clock, his horse watered and tied at the post, his hat in his hands when she opened the door. He'd shaved. That told her something. She stepped back and let him in. Her daughter, Clara, was at the table with a bowl of oatmeal and a primer open beside it. Clara was 11 years old, narrow-shouldered and watchful, with her late father's dark eyes. She looked at the man in the doorway with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, simply assessing, the way Martha herself assessed things. This is Mr. Croft, Martha said. He may be working here. Maybe, Abel repeated, looking at the girl. Maybe, Clara agreed, and went back to her primer. Abel sat across from Martha at the kitchen table, while Clara ate and studied with the determined inattention of a child pretending not to listen. Martha set out coffee, and they went through the arrangement properly. She showed him the deed, the soil map, the debt ledger. He read slowly and carefully, which she respected. A man who reads carefully before agreeing is a man who means to honor what he agrees to. The south field, he said, tapping the soil map. Clay base, sandy loam over hardpan. It'll break if you give it time. It needs 2 passes and good amendment. I'll need to know what equipment you have. She told him. 1 plow, 1 team of horses, a disc harrow with a cracked frame that could be welded, 3 good shovels, and a root cellar she'd stocked through her own labor every autumn since James died. He listened. He asked reasonable questions. He didn't talk about himself unless she asked, and she asked twice. Once about his experience. He'd worked 4 ranches, 1 farm, and a mine, in that order, over 12 years, and once about the Boise jail. A man was beating his horse in the street, Abel said simply. I told him to stop. He didn't. Clara's spoon went still for 1 second. Then she started eating again. 3 nights is a long sentence for stepping between a man and his horse, Martha said. The man's brother was the deputy, Abel said. Martha nodded. That was enough. She understood how things worked in small jurisdictions. She'd buried a husband in one. I'll draw up the terms in writing. If you agree to them, we can speak to Reverend Hadley by the end of the week. Abel looked at the room around him, at the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the quilt folded neatly at the end of the settle, the second chair pulled close to the stove. His face showed nothing particular. All right, he said, I'll agree to the terms. Reverend Hadley married them on a Thursday with Clara as witness and the storekeeper's wife as the other, because the law required 2. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Martha wore her second-best dress, which was blue wool, and Abel wore a clean shirt she hadn't seen before, so he'd acquired it somewhere between Tuesday and Thursday, which meant he was capable of small preparations, which she filed away as a good sign. There was no celebration. They drove home in the wagon, Clara between them on the bench seat, the horses pulling steady against the cold. When they reached the homestead, Abel unhitched the team, watered them, and put them up in the barn with the efficiency of a man who had done it 1,000 times. Martha started supper. Clara set the table for 3. It was Clara who placed the third setting. Martha didn't ask her to. The girl simply opened the drawer, took out the extra fork, and laid it at the place across from her own with the same matter-of-fact precision she brought to everything. Abel came in from the barn, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down where the place had been set without comment. Martha brought the pot from the stove. They ate. It was the quietest meal Martha had taken in 2 years, but it was not an empty quiet. It was the quiet of people who are learning the shape of a new arrangement, feeling out its edges carefully, the way you probe ice before you trust your weight to it. Martha noticed that he ate everything she put in front of him and said thank you for it. She noticed that when he reached across the table for the bread, he moved slowly, without claiming space, the way a man moves when he knows he's a guest and hasn't yet decided if he's also a resident. November settled over the homestead like a gray wool blanket. Abel slept in the barn the first week, his choice, not hers, and she didn't argue it because she understood. A man who moves carefully also sleeps carefully, at least at first. He was up before dawn every morning. She could hear the axe from her window, steady and unhurried, the sound of it carrying across the frozen ground in the dark like a metronome. By the end of the first week, the woodpile beside the cabin had grown to a height she hadn't seen since James was alive. He moved into the small lean-to room off the back of the cabin after the first hard frost, which was only sensible. She had framed it as practical when she'd mentioned it, and he had accepted it as practical, and that was the nature of their exchange in those weeks. Everything practical, everything clean, nothing that couldn't be explained by weather or economy. But practical things have a way of becoming something else when repeated often enough in a small house. She noticed that he banked the kitchen fire last every night, after she and Clara had gone to bed, so the cabin stayed warm till morning. She noticed that he fixed the lean-to latch on the root cellar door without being asked, after he'd seen her struggle with it once. She noticed one cold evening that he had carried her empty water buckets from the kitchen to the pump and back again, full, and set them inside without a word, while she was busy with Clara's lessons. She did not mention any of these things to him. She was not sentimental, she reminded herself, but she noticed them. She put them away in the part of her mind that was keeping a true accounting, not of debts, but of character. Clara noticed too. The girl was careful about the man in the way children are careful about anyone who enters their established world, watchful, measuring, assigning small tests without announcing them. She left a book on the kitchen table one evening, opened to a page with difficult words, and watched covertly to see what he would do. He sat down and read it. He turned the page. He asked her the next morning if she'd gotten to the chapter about the expedition, because he thought it was the best one. Clara looked at him for a long moment and then said she hadn't, and he told her what happened in it, in plain language that made her laugh once without meaning to. The external pressure Martha had feared arrived in mid-December, carried in by her brother-in-law Clement Greer on a borrowed horse, and a face full of moral indignation. Clement was James's younger brother, a soft man made of sharp opinions, who had believed since James's death that the homestead should pass to him by the logic of men who believe the world is organized in their favor. He arrived on a Tuesday and sat himself down in her kitchen without being asked, and looked at Abel with the naked suspicion of a man who sees a rival but won't call it that. "I've heard you took in a laborer," Clement said to Martha. "I've heard you called it a marriage." "I called it a marriage because it is one," Martha said. She did not sit. She stood at the stove and kept her hands busy. The Reverend performed the ceremony. It's registered at the county office. "You've known this man 5 minutes. You don't know his people. You don't know his history." Clement's voice dropped to something confidential and oily. "There are ways to have a contract set aside, Martha. If you've been imprudent, no one needs to know. You can still sell this place and come live with Dora and me in town, the way James would have wanted." "James," Martha said, "wanted me to stay on this land. He said so plainly, and I was there for the conversation, which you were not. She set down her spoon and looked at her brother-in-law. I am not selling. I am not setting aside the marriage, and I would ask you not to imply that I have been imprudent in my own kitchen. Clement turned to Abel, who had been sitting at the table through all of this with his coffee, quiet as a fence post. And you, what are you after exactly? A man with nothing coming in and setting himself up in a widow's home. It doesn't take long to see what that looks like. Abel set down his cup. He looked at Clement with those gray eyes. Not angry eyes, Martha thought, but certain ones, which was different. I'm after the south field broken by May, and the barn roof sound before spring runoff. I'm after a fair share of the harvest for honest work, same as the contract says. If you want to see the contract, I'll get it. He paused. And I'd ask you to remember there's a child in this house who can hear every word. Clara was in the next room. The silence after Abel said that was the particular silence of a man who has made his point without raising his voice and knows it. Clement left before supper. He said he'd be back with his lawyer, and perhaps he would, but Martha had stopped worrying about Clement's lawyers the way she'd stopped worrying about other things that had more sound than substance. What struck her, riding the rest of that afternoon in her mind, was the thing Abel had said about Clara. Not about the land, not about the contract, not about himself, about the girl. She told herself it was a practical observation. A man who understood that children are affected by adult arguments was simply a man with sense. That was all. But that night she found herself looking at the woodpile, higher than it had ever been before February, and the repaired cellar latch, and the banked fire, and the third place at the table that had become simply the table as it was set now, every night, without anyone remarking on it. She looked at all of that and felt something shift in her chest, quiet and structural, like a good log settling in a sound wall. Abel found her standing on the porch that evening after Clara was asleep. The sky was navy and full of stars, the kind of clear that means the cold will bite hard before dawn. She had her coat wrapped around herself and her breath made small clouds in the dark. He came and stood beside her without asking if she wanted company. He didn't say anything for a while. That was something she had come to understand about him in the 6 weeks he'd been here. His silences were not the silences of a man who has nothing to say, but of a man who waits until words are worth the saying. Clement will come back, she said finally. Likely, Abel agreed. His kind generally does. I don't have money for a long legal fight. He was quiet another moment. The cold pressed in. Then, I know a man in Boise who owes me a good turn. He's an attorney. No relation to any deputy. The corner of his mouth moved. He'd look at the deed and the contract and write a letter that would make Clement's lawyer very tired. Martha turned and looked at him. In the starlight his face was difficult to read, but she'd been learning it, and she could see that he meant it. You don't have to call in favors on my account. It's our account, he said. That's what the contract says. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Yes, she said, it does. She went back inside then, because the cold was real, and she was practical. But she left the door open a beat longer than she needed to, and he came in after her, and the fire was warm, and neither of them remarked on any of it. Christmas came without fanfare but with more warmth than Martha had allowed herself to expect. Abel traded labor with the Delaney brothers and came home with a small spruce that he and Clara decorated with strips of red cloth from the rag bag and pine cones they'd gathered on an afternoon walk the week prior. Martha made a ginger cake from the last of the dried ginger, and they ate it at the table by the light of 2 candles while the wind worked at the eaves and failed to get in. There was a moment that evening when Clara fell asleep in the settle with the primer on her chest and the candles burning low, and Martha looked up from her mending to find Abel watching the girl with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, unguarded and gentle and faintly wondering. The way you look at something you didn't expect to love." She did not say anything. He looked away a moment later, back to the hinge he was repairing in the lamplight. But she had seen it, and she understood that some things were happening between them that were not in the contract and had not been negotiated. January was the hard month. It came in with a blizzard that lasted 3 days and sealed the cabin in white silence. They were snug enough. The woodpile held, the food stores held, the horses were well bedded in the barn. But 3 days of close quarters in a small cabin has a way of erasing the formal distances a man and woman erect between themselves when they are performing a practical arrangement. By the second day they had stopped saying only necessary things. By the third day they were talking the way people talk when there is nothing to protect themselves against. About the land, yes, but also about other things. He told her about a farm in Oregon he'd worked as a young man that had grown the finest winter wheat he'd ever seen, and how the smell of it at harvest was something he'd carried with him the years since. She told him about her own arrival in Idaho Territory at 19, following James west with nothing but a trunk and the certainty of a girl who doesn't know yet what certainty costs. "Did you regret it?" Abel asked. "Following him?" "No," she said. "I regret that he's gone. Those aren't the same regret." He nodded slowly. "No," he said, "they're not." On the third day, when the snow had eased and the light came back clean and blinding across the white fields, he went out to dig the path to the barn, and she watched him from the window and let herself think a thought she had been refusing to think for 2 months. It was a plain thought and not dramatic. It went, "I am glad he is here, not for the woodpile or the south field or the legal contract, simply here, in this place, in this life, glad of the man himself." She turned from the window and started breakfast and said nothing about it to anyone. But the thought was there now, fully formed, the way some things are once you stop pushing against them. In February, Abel built a second shelf in the kitchen for her preserves, because the single shelf she had was full and she had been stacking jars on the floor. He built it from leftover cedar he'd salvaged from the barn repairs, cut and planed it smooth, and fixed it to the wall on a Saturday morning while she and Clara were at the creek breaking ice for water. When they came back and she saw it there, straight and solid, smelling of fresh cedar above her stove, she stopped in the doorway. He was cleaning up the sawdust. He didn't make anything of it. "Should hold a good 40 jars, he said. She said, "It's well made." He nodded and swept the floor. That was all they said. But she moved her preserves onto it that same afternoon, every jar in order, and when she stepped back and looked at the kitchen with the new shelf full and the stove warm and the table set for 3, she felt the kind of satisfaction that is not about a shelf at all. Spring came the way it always comes to Idaho, not gently but insistently, pushing up through the mud, insisting on itself. The south field went soft in March, and Abel was out in it within the week, working the team back and forth across the hardpan with the determination of a man who has made a promise and intends to keep it. Martha brought his lunch out to the field in a covered pot, and they sat on the wagon tongue together in the March sun, which was thin but real, and ate without needing to fill the space with words. He had written to his attorney friend in Boise in January. A letter had come back in February and gone to Clement's lawyer, and there had been no further word from Clement since. The homestead was theirs, hers, legally, and in every practical sense his as well. The contract was sound. One afternoon in late March she came out to the field with his coffee and found Clara already there, sitting on the fence rail watching him work, the two of them in easy conversation about something Martha couldn't hear from the distance. She stopped walking and just watched. Her daughter on the rail, her husband, turning the earth below the pale spring sky, and the easy way they talked, the way people talk who have stopped being careful around each other. She thought of what Mrs. Perlow had said in October. Unsuitable. She thought of how the world is organized by people who confuse standing with worth. She walked out to the field with the coffee. That evening, after supper, after Clara was in bed, Martha sat across from Abel at the table with the lamp between them. She had been forming words for 3 days, and she was tired of carrying them alone. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked up from the harness he was mending. He waited. "This started as a contract," she said. "I was clear about that. I meant to keep it clear." "You were clear," he said. "I'm not clear about it anymore," Martha said. She kept her voice steady. "I find that I have become glad, not of the arrangement, of you." She put her hands flat on the table, the way she did when she was saying something important. "I don't know what to do with that, practically, but I thought you should know it." The lamp flickered once. Outside, the first true warmth of spring was in the air, soft and promising. Abel set down the harness. He looked at her across the table with those steady gray eyes, and for once she could read his face entirely, because he wasn't guarding it. What was there was what she had seen him give Clara in an unguarded moment at Christmas, but directed at her now, and it was not a small thing. "Martha," he said, "I built that shelf for the kitchen because I wanted to see your kitchen full. I banked that fire every night because I wanted you to wake up warm. I fixed the cellar latch because I watched you struggle with it, and I didn't like watching that." He paused. "None of that was in the contract." "No," she said, "it wasn't. I have been glad," he said quietly, "since about the 3rd week of November." She looked at him. She laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her, and it sounded strange in the quiet kitchen, and then it sounded exactly right. He smiled, a full and unguarded smile, and that was the first time she'd seen that entirely. "That's earlier than me," she said. "I'm a faster study," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and the lamp burned warm between them, and the bargain became something else, something chosen, freely, by 2 people who had each earned the right to choose carefully. There is a kind of wisdom the frontier teaches you, if you stay long enough to learn it. It does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, like a man with decent boots worn to nothing who shaves before he comes to ask for a chance. It arrives like a girl who sets an extra place at the table before anyone asks her to, because she has more sense than the matchmaker and more faith than the doubters. The pact between Martha Greer and Abel Croft was a practical document signed in November. It became a life before spring. That is how the best things happen, not in grand declarations, but in banked fires and mended latches and cedar shelves and hands held across a kitchen table when the lamp is burning low. If you have ever been told you were unsuitable, or that the person you needed was the wrong kind of person, you know what Martha knew that March evening, that the people who decide who is suitable have often never needed anyone at all. We are glad you spent this evening with us on the frontier. Tell us in the comments what you thought was the moment Abel truly became part of that family. Was it the shelf, or the fence line conversation, or something else? Subscribe and stay close, because we have more stories from the Old West waiting for you, and each one carries the same truth home. Good night. God bless you and yours.